At that time, I was very weak. Lacking a body made me vulnerable. If I had not taken Jonathan Joestar's body, if it hadn't been for his energy to augment my own limited source, I couldn't have survived at the bottom of that ocean for 100 years.
I have a confession to make. I love villains. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone coming back to this channel. Hell, probably some of my favorite videos have been delving into the insanity of villains. And I like villains as they can come in many different shapes, sizes, shades, and some other word that begins with the letter S that escapes my brain at the moment. A few months ago, I talked about one of my favorite villains, Yoshikage Kira. He's probably one of my favorite villains in JoJo, not counting the future antagonists in the manga that haven't been adapted yet. He's also what a lot of villains should strive to be as well, and probably one of the better villains in media. And yet, I wouldn't say he's the most iconic villains in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. No, that would go to the one, the only, Dio. To make it clear, I'm talking about this Dio, not this Dio. This one, not this one. Yes! No. We good? Good. I'm MangaKamen, and...
Are you ready to rock, boys and girls? I said, are you ready to rock?
Dio Brando, the man, the myth, the legend. But who is Dio? Well, to be frank, he's probably one of the most iconic villains in all of anime and manga, and he happens to be what a lot of villains should strive to be as well. Dio has this charm to him. He's over the top. He actually manages to be a threat, extremely entertaining, and even after his canonical death in the series, his legacy still managed to affect it afterwards, and even influenced pop culture for years. Damn these memes, but they were still influential on the internet and certainly drew more people to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Before actually getting to the canonical origins of Dio from a story perspective and why he's a great villain, I want to take some time and talk about Araki's choices when it came to creating Dio. According to the interviews in the JoJoium with Araki, he took inspiration from FBI profiling of serial killers, pointing out that they need to have a level of strength in order to commit the heinous crimes that they do. It should also be known that Araki also looked towards serial killers who controlled their victims through psychological manipulation, a similar ability that Dio himself showcases throughout the series. How he's able to really tempt those who work for him, scare other people, and of course, playing mind games with other characters. FBI psychological profiling was a hot topic around the time that I wrote this. Why do serial killers do what they do, scientifically speaking? I was inspired by that when I was working on Dio. Guys like that are true scumbags, rotten to the core, yet I've always sort of thought that they are actually incredibly strong for being able to commit such crimes. Why do they go so far? Do they do it just to see if they can? The control aspect of it interests me as well. Dio's physical appearance was taken from pop culture. In this case, the character Roy Batty from the Blade Runner movie, the 1982 version, the good one. This is in line with a lot of Araki's works of inspiration, taking things from pop culture and retooling them for his work. As I've said before, he did the same thing with Kira. And in one of the many interviews that Araki gave, he said the following about Dio. I mentioned this back when I was talking about Jonathan, but Dio was actually the one I want to draw the most for part 1. How far can a man's ambition drive him when he takes it to the ultimate extreme? One of Araki's goals with Dio was to showcase just how far a person was willing to go for their ambitions, even going so far as to throw away their humanity and kicking a dog.
Ready, Ike? Kick the baby! Don't kick the baby. Kick the baby.
And that's intentional. Araki wanted to make Dio inexcusable. A lot of villains will justify or excuse their own evil. You've probably heard the whole spiel of everyone's the hero of their own story. Villains don't see themselves as villains. You know, that whole thing. But when it comes to Dio, that phrase is bullshit! Dio as a character is someone who, while having reasons for his actions, he doesn't apologize. He gives no excuses. And he'll gladly give you a smile, all before he throws a knife at your throat. There's just something about seeing a character who smiles a lot, whether that smile is for good or bad purposes, that makes you want to like them, even if they happen to be a psychopath. Araki loved to draw Dio. You can see that with every panel that he shows the character, and Dio is a visually appealing and interesting person. Dio's also a guy who will just sip wine as one of his lackeys just casually cuts his own head off at Dio's request. But now that we've got a good idea of who Dio is, let's talk about how Dio is.
Shall be the key. Now burn!
Born in the year of 1869 on the cold streets of London, Dio, as a young man, was raised for the first 10 years of his life by his abusive, drunk father, Dario, and even lived through the death of his own mother. This is pretty much all we really know about Dio's past from the manga and anime. Aside from the fact that he earned money by playing chess, Araki has also stated that he doesn't like to go too in-depth with villains suffering while showing their backstory, since, well, they're the bad guys, and logically speaking, the heroes do need to defeat them after all. It wouldn't do too good for the villains to become overly sympathetic for the character that is supposed to be defeated by the heroes. However, from what clues we are given by Araki's illustrations and writing, we can glean some information that's below the surface. Take, for example, the first sentence I said in this section. Yeah, that one where I was a dork trying to be overly dramatic. Even the setting that I gave, the time and place, can give us an idea into the backstory of Dio, as well as his motivations in part 1, and even going further into the future where parts where Dio is still alive in. Year 1867 coincidentally lines up with the Reform Act of the same year, where it was essentially a time where classism and the right to vote in the working class was null. This was a time and country where classism and obviously living conditions that weren't the greatest for those in the lower classes existed. Considering the context that we're given in both the anime and manga, we can see that Dio wasn't really all that respectable and probably lived more on the streets. And with an abusive father, we can really see the beginnings of a broken young man. Oddly enough, Dio does showcase a lot of signs of abuse victims. Not to claim I'm some sort of psychologist on the internet like most YouTubers, but a quick Google search does show things such as destructiveness, low empathy, cruelty, and other assortments of the big-brained words that make the YouTuber look smarter than he actually is. Duh. Even considering the time period and location, it wouldn't be a stretch of the imagination that Dio grew to resent any and all those who are in a higher class than him. And it's that resentment that allowed Dio to essentially do whatever he could to escape his situation. In a sense, it's just the willingness to survive. And a cornered animal will do anything to survive. Dio as a child was broken down mentally and physically, and why he has such a misanthropic view on humanity, one that carries into his actions as he poisons his own father and by the grace of God or a devil, is brought into the Joestar family. Considering the background and upbringing, it wouldn't be any surprise that Dio would hate the Joestars. For all his life up to that point, Dio was suffering at the hands of fate, and the world dealing him a terrible hand. Meanwhile, Jonathan was given a privileged life. When Dio first meets up with Jonathan, the young blonde writes off Jojo as a spoiled rich brat. And he's not really wrong about that, since we are shown scenes of Jojo acting as such. Dio doesn't see another kid. He doesn't see someone who could potentially be a friend or a brother. He just sees a stepping stone on his path to the top. And incidentally, lashes out on Jojo in a similar vein as what Dio had experienced when he was a young kid at the hands of Dario. You better not act high and mighty just because I'm staying in your home. I don't let anyone swagger over me. I mean, Dio really doesn't know Jojo at this point. He doesn't know Jojo as a person or a character and doesn't make an effort to do so. If anything, this bleeds into Dio doing similar crimes against Jojo that Dario did. Only to an extent that's a little bit more. Killing Jojo's dog, intentionally trying to physically assault Jojo with dirty tricks, and of course...
It was I, Dio!
Ironically enough, it's a cycle of abuse that Dio was perpetuating. It was due to the inability to trust in people, and one that's not completely unfounded. Isolation makes a man hollow. Speaking from experience, are we, Dio? Dio got what a lot of people wouldn't be able to get, even in today's world. He got a second chance at a good life. Jojo and his father George were willing to take him in as one of their own family, but the scars of Dio's backstory pushed him to view those two as nothing more than the rich elites that looked down on him, even if they didn't actually do so. And unfortunately, eventually, something breaks. Honestly, one thing I need to point out with the manga and in the place of the popular anime adaptation is that the manga we get is a bit more defensive pose that Dio takes here. With his arms crossed, his tears a lot more prominent, and even seeing his body shaking, you can see that this really does affect Dio, that a spoiled brat that he had written off had just kicked his ass. It really solidifies in my mind that Dio was a broken young man who wanted to inflict the same pain that he had gotten onto someone else. And it's at this point that Dio changes. Inflicting this kind of pain wouldn't really work against someone who has proven that he is willing to fight back and can beat him down. Again, this is what I have managed to interpret from Dio. Backstory and actions do have on-scene information from them that allow me to infer more aspects of Dio's character in a more hypothetical standard. And I should point out that Araki's characterization still makes Dio to be a straight-up bastard, especially after the time skip in part 1, where Dio plays a bit more of a subtle game, switching his tactics to that of poisoning George in the same way he did with Dario. I think we should talk about George Joestar for a moment when it comes to Dio's backstory. It's actually rather important in regards to Dio. As stated before, Dio got a second chance at life, but the wounds from his former life and father certainly interfered with that aspect, even when there was a more, positive father figure in his life. I hesitated there for a sec because George is a different kind of bad father, not so much abusive or a drunkard, but because he was kind of blind to what Dio was doing, as well as using a switch on Jojo for getting a question wrong, and even starves Jojo over bad table manners. This did actually get Jojo into a prime mindset for Dio to take advantage of, but also take this thought into account. How would Dio ever respect another father, especially one who treated his own flesh and blood like this over things that are really that minor? With the phantom of Dario hanging over Dio's shoulders, it should be obvious that Dio would have a bad view of fathers especially. Hell, Dio even blamed Dario for the death of his own mother. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the scene where Dio was stumbling in the streets after Jojo discovered his plot of poisoning George, mirroring the alcoholism that Dario had. It's really interesting to consider that as much as Dio hates the blood of his own father that flows through his veins, and ironically enough, Dio inherited a lot what made him despise Dario. Got Dario's cruelty, his conniving nature. Remember, Dario was willing to rob a dead man at an accident. His sadism, his greed. Hell, if it wasn't because of fate, an actual thing in JoJo, mind you, Dio would have been in the exact same place as Dario had been, a drunk in the gutter. Now, all of this is a reason for why Dio does the things he does. However, they aren't an excuse. At least, not to an outside viewer like you or me. Or that one guy in the back. Down in front! Dio, though? Yes, he believes that his past of why he is the way he is, and that those who show him kindness haven't had a taste of his own life and are only for him to use. And Dio doesn't think of himself as a bad person. And I know what you're thinking, and typing down below, because that directly contradicts what I had said at the beginning of this video. What did I say again? And that's intentional. Araki wanted to make Dio inexcusable. A lot of villains will justify or excuse their own evil. You probably heard the whole spiel of everyone's the hero of their own story. Villains don't see themselves as villains. Oh yeah, that. And you'd be right. Except that, my friends, is basic humanity. But the Dio I'm referring to at the beginning...
I reject my humanity!
When Dio kills George, using his blood to awaken the power of the stone mask, that's the moment that Dio truly throws off the shackles of his past, his lies to everyone, and becomes an immortal vampire. There's a line that I honestly find intriguing from Speedwagon before this happens. He was born evil. Normally, I hate lines like this, mainly because it stems from the idea of nature versus nurture, where bad behavior is ingrained into a person's very essence and soul. Personally speaking, I believe no one is born evil or good, and that we enter this world as a blank slate. But enough of my moral grandstanding, the phrase actually describes what Dio does. If he was born evil, then there's no reason for him to keep his humanity. After all, if you were meant to be an evil person, you might as well not be human at the same time. And with his humanity now stripped from him, Dio can finally be free. He can be himself, and he can indulge into every vice and no longer make excuses for himself. After all, if he was born evil, he might as well go all out, right? Why not consider yourself top of the food chain? After all, from Dio's perspective, humanity has looked down upon him, and now humans have become his cattle. So obviously he's the superior life form, right? No one tell Dio about cars. There's a lot more to Dio that we can talk about, but we're specifically focusing on the past for this section, and to explain that while Dio does have a tragic past, the moment he discards his humanity, he discards his excuses for the things that he does. He removes his fears, and as such, he no longer needs to be chained down by his human nature, and become one of the most iconic characters throughout the series.
Again. Just now, a most intense feeling like someone somewhere is watching me.
I think he's talking to you.
As I've stated before in other videos, a villain needs to be able to be a threat to the heroes. And since Dio has about 2 different modus operandi in the 2 parts that he was actually alive, and had different abilities, I think we'll focus on that aspect. I alluded in the previous part that Dio often had to rely on his own intellect, and play a bit more coy with his goals of attaining the Joestar fortune. But all of that changed when he gave up his humanity. It's nearly impossible for a regular man to kill a vampire, at least in the world of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, at least a normal man. Not to say that Dio's own mental faculties were completely eliminated from when he became a vampire, but it was clear that his focus had changed to a bit more of a power focus. I mean, the guy could shoot pressurized jets of fluid that acted like high-pressured water cannons and could freeze people by the mere touch. He also had the ability to create zombies and then later full-on vampires so he could create more lackeys as he saw fit. There was a lot more egotism when Dio became a vampire, and it's obvious to see that when he came to his fights against Jonathan, it's what he calls anything that JoJo does.
It's useless, 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 useless!
Doesn't have the same sting of Muda Muda Muda, now does it? Still, when Dio does gain his vampiric powers, he essentially goes,
Don't care, didn't ask, cry about it, stay mad, get real, Elmald seed cope.
but as we all know... Of course, when he lost his body and became just a head, Dio had to resort to more backhanded tactics, and that still didn't work out too well for him, at least for 100 years. We then get to part 3 Dio. Well, in the timeline there's a fair bit where he spends time with Poochie, but that's not the point for this section. With a newly minted ass,
But he's got a nice yuddy yuddy.
Dio had to hide more into the shadows while his body recovered, and as such had to rely more on outside help, with a new power from stand users, which was an ability that Dio also received when he was back in the world of the living. Funnily enough, the I-beams and the cold abilities were just gone. Granted, what Dio got in return more than makes up for it, but for those abilities to just disappear, especially since he could do the I-beams when he was still ahead, I'm just nitpicking at the moment though. Let's talk about Dio's stand power. There was a bit of a fan theory that I do want to bring up, and that's that Dio was supposed to have these stand abilities that were all showcased. This theory stemmed from 2 aspects. The fact that Dio was able to have a variation of Hermit Purple, and the second being that his Arcana was that of the world. The first is kind of self-explanatory, since stands are supposed to be unique manifestations of their user. Although this one is more often countered with the fact that Dio is using Jonathan's body, and that's his stand that Dio is using. Whether or not that's true, well, I don't really know or care. But let's take a different look at the world. In the major arcana, the world often refers to a reflection of the journey that a person takes. It would make sense if Dio had the abilities of the previous stand users, since before reaching the actual second half of the arc, the stands were based on the arcana of the tarot deck. Well, that was thrown out the window when the Egyptian stands were introduced. Still, here's where we can look towards the actual abilities of Dio's stand, the world. As anyone who knows anything about this show knows, the world's time stop ability is probably one of the more dangerous powers at this stage in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Yes, future characters in later parts do have much more powerful stance, as well as more creative abilities. Yes, Bunny Valentine, your day will come someday. Maybe if this video gets 1 million views or something, I don't know. I highly doubt that'll happen. The world has another meaning in the Arcana, and one that I really feel reflects Dio as a character in part 3, which is what this section will really focus on. While the world does signify completion while in the upright position, it can also signify when you are near completing your goals, which is what Dio is essentially at in his conquest. When the Joestar Egyptian group finally made their way to Dio's hiding place, he was all but fully recovered. He was so close to taking back the world at night. The only real obstacle was the Joestars that had searched through the sands of Egypt to stop him, and one that while he still had a bit of worry for, after all, he had learned about the tenacity of the Joestar bloodline against Jonathan. While Dio still possesses egotism, he also became a lot more careful in his approach for the Joestars. He didn't rush into battle all willy-nilly against Joseph, aware that the power of Haman could still affect him, and when Jotaro Kujo seemed to display his ability to move through Dio's frozen world, Dio did whatever he could to make sure that Jotaro was only playing a joke on the guy. And then when Jotaro actually enters his world, Dio becomes a lot more creative with his powers and abilities. Even when he believes that Jotaro is alive, even if there's just a fraction of a chance that Jotaro is, Dio keeps his distance from the downed Jojo, even listening to see if there was a heartbeat in the teen's body. This to me shows that Dio grew as a character when it came to his abilities in fighting, because while he does have a more overwhelming power that is growing every time he uses it, he cannot afford to underestimate his opponents, especially the little brat who apparently has the same power as him. Dio vs Jotaro is probably one of my more favorite fights in the animated series, as it really does ramp up the tension between the two, along with a crisp animation that spans over the course of several episodes. It does make the fight quite the nail-biter. And of course, Dio's demented tactics lead one to the most iconic moments in all of the series, and maybe in anime. There's just something cathartic about watching a teenager getting crushed by a road roller. And before you take that out of context, it's not like we had this moment.
Watch out!
Dio just made one major mistake.
You pissed me off.
I mean, anyone can piss off Jotaro easily, so can you really call that a mistake on Dio's part? And to top it off, Dio knows that he's the cream of the crop. He's the best of the best. He's got probably one of the most abusable stands in the series. On a side note, if you're wondering about the tanks on the world's back, apparently Araki designed that on purpose because he wanted Dio to be able to breathe during the stop time. Which makes some sense, I guess. And to make things more interesting, the world was the first stand that Araki actually designed, and was the beginning of the JoJo villain's trend of messing with the aspect of time. Sure, Dio is strong as a character, and can even play mind tricks with his stand the world, like how he did with Polnareff. But I think another aspect of Dio that makes him dangerous is his manipulative tendencies. And this is something that we talked about before. However, what we're looking at here is essentially a deal with the devil. Oftentimes, Dio is shown to be a master of manipulation with the stand users in the third part, whether it be through terror, using his flesh buds, or other ways. Dio was a threat. And even after his death, he was still a threat throughout the rest of the original universe's run. His ideology and plans lasting for far longer than even him. I'll talk about part 6 in a later segment of this video, but there's one more thing I want to bring up before we get to that part. This won't be a long chapter, but one that needs to be brought up. When it comes to villains, especially your main villain, they need to be a foil to the main character of your story. While foils aren't exclusive to villains, I feel like foils are the best way to think about your villains, since they're supposed to oppose the main character of your story, as well as act as a contrast to the characters in order to highlight their attributes. This is for both villains and heroes. Now, for say someone like Jonathan Joestar, that's actually quite easy. Mainly because Jonathan's about as entertaining as a piece of wood. Careful not to rub two sticks together near him or you might have a spark of personality there. I'm obviously joking when I say that, but there is quite a bit of contrast between the two characters, aside from the obvious of their upbringings which I already covered. Characterization, Jonathan is often portrayed as a dorky nice guy, while Dio is an ambitious, evil street rat. Jojo wants to be a perfect gentleman, willing to risk himself for strangers. Dio loves to exploit people and kill dogs. And there goes my monetization. Thanks, YouTube! When it comes to the supernatural abilities they acquire, they're also opposing, with Haman and vampirism being the obvious there. Even their color choices are often in contrast to each other, especially after they get their powers, where Jonathan is often wearing blue while Dio wears red. I think it's also telling that when Jojo has defeated Dio, Dio grows to form a sort of respect to Jonathan, even to the point where Dio sees Jonathan being the only acceptable replacement for his new body. He even chastises his lackey who gives Jonathan disrespect. And funnily enough, one could even see that Dio understood that Jonathan's affection, even in the last moments as Jojo held Dio's head in his dying arms, that Jonathan was sincere. If it wasn't for Jonathan, Dio wouldn't have a new body to take into the new world. Dio saw Jonathan as the only person he's ever accepted as an equal, even when he was willing to kill Jonathan to save his own skin. Then if we were to compare him to the third JoJo we follow, Jotaro Kujo, there's even more of a contrast between the two. Even the structure of the story plays with this, since Jotaro was on the hunt for Dio to save his mother. Meanwhile, Dio is staying hidden within Cairo while his body adjusts and he practices with his stand. Other aspects to Dio being a foil with Jotaro, Dio tends to be over the top and present himself with enough charisma to make others loyal to his vampiric abs, but also willing to throw them away at a moment's notice. Jotaro starts off by telling his mother to
Shut up! Get out of my face, you bitch!
and is seen to be so stoic that I often think that Jotaro is unable to show any actual emotions. However, that's a mask. Jotaro does care for others and has a good sense of justice and is surprisingly intelligent for a guy who looks like this. In that vein, Dio's really open with his personality, while Jotaro often hides his actual personality under his rough exterior. Heck, even their color codes are actually in distinction. Dio's primary colors in Part 3 are surprisingly bright yellow and gold, meanwhile Jotaro's got all his black coloring to him. I think because these two characters have such a contrast to each other that adds to the memorability of their battle in the streets of Cairo. When you see a clash of two completely different characters that have a lot of diametric elements, it becomes enthralling to watch them cross blows, play mind games with each other, and how the fight twists and turns. If you wanted to really get into the nitty-gritty of things though, Dio actively embraced the culture of Cairo and even says this line in the manga: "I outsmarted you. Don't you recognize this street I'm flying down? Or do all of the streets look the same to a tourist?" That line implies that Dio probably is more familiar with the streets of Cairo, which makes the idea of him going out at night often. And we also see that Dio is capable of navigating the streets to find the knives and even the road roller. Because, yeah, when you think about it, Jotaro is a tourist, and Dio is an actual resident of Cairo. And going back to their outfits, Jotaro does wear his home country's culture literally on his sleeve, what with his uniform. Meanwhile, Dio's baggy pants and cropped jacket aren't exactly unheard of in several Middle Eastern cultures, including Egypt. Even the ring bracelets and curled shoes that Dio wears are also reminiscent of that culture. So one could say that Dio embraced the culture, while Jotaro didn't. Jotaro vs. Dio is probably one of the most iconic fights in the series, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of people who will say that there are a lot more fights that are memorable, and hey, that's fine. Not everyone can be right at all the time, especially when it comes to personal preferences. Still, I would argue that Dio is probably one of the most important characters within the original universe's timeline and has far-reaching implications for each part. Him being a foil to the characters just being part of that reason for that.
Get back, Jojo!
This is the part of the video where I talk about some of the less than specific aspects of Dio's character and actually reflects today's modern writing. Dio as a character throughout JoJo has a unique role, especially in the original universe part, that there's a shadow of Dio in the parts after 3. I stated earlier that Dio was probably one of Araki's favorite characters to draw, and I feel as though because of that, Dio's influence throughout the series has managed to ring true throughout the very least the original universe, at least to some degree. To make a long story short, let's consider the following. It was because of the bow and arrow that was used to give Dio his own stand powers that kicked off the events of Morio, especially in regards to Kira getting his own stand. His own flesh and blood, Giorno, became the main protagonist of Part 5, although his connection to Dio didn't really come up at all, but I digress. I mean, I would have killed to have Polnareff have a reaction to learning that Giorno was Dio's kid.
You what?
And in Part 6, Stone Ocean, Dio's teaching and relationship with Father Pucci, well, I'm sure you can guess from there, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Dio's shadow is cast over the entirety of the original universe's storyline, so when you have Jotaro saying that Dio is the Joestar family enemy, he isn't kidding. Even in death, Dio's influence and scorn still managed to resurface. And on a meta level, Dio started a lot of trends when it comes to JoJo villains, being over the top, having insane quirks, and having a time and space reality bending stand. Although if you really think about it, Dio's motivations are really basic and standard fare for villains. He wants to create an ideal world, one where he reigns supreme over everyone, basically taking over the world. Initially through his time-stopping ability and through his plans with Pucci to reset the world. I do think we need to talk about Pucci a little bit for this, since this does open up quite a bit of characterization for Dio, even if it's done retroactively and through flashbacks. Something that the heroes will never really know in the actual story. Because through the interactions with Pucci, we do see a different side of Dio, one that's more methodical and more inquisitive. This isn't trying to make Dio into less of a villain, but rarely do we get to see these kinds of moments where the main villains are just talking in normal conversation with another person. I think his conversations with Pucci, not only do we see some oddities with Dio's personality, like him building a model ship while talking to the young priest, and that can gleam a few interesting thoughts. Especially when we consider that he has the lifeboats out from the model and his ultimate hiding place was a desert. It's kind of funny when you think about it, especially when you consider that Dio spent about 100 years at the bottom of the ocean. It's elements like these that aren't explicitly told in the text, but are shown in the artwork and thinking back to the characters' events in their life that do flesh out the characters a bit more. These kinds of thoughts can elude the audience since it's more of a background storytelling and not shoved in your face, which is something you can really appreciate when you go back a few times to watch and read the material, and it really gets you thinking about the characters. If you recall when we talked about Dio's backstory about how he was abused as a child, watched his own mother dying before his very eyes by the bastard he had to call a father, and how time and classism of that period turned his father into a monster, Dio's ultimate goal, as revealed in part 6, makes a lot of sense. His goal, revealed in conversations with Pucci, is to acquire heaven, or to acquire happiness. Dario's a bastard, no doubt about that. But I doubt the guy became a drunk abuser because he was satisfied with his life, and in turn, Dio became a monster as well because of this unhappiness, even going so far to kill his father, killing a dog, and killing his adopted father. Throughout Dio's life, he had been attempting to rectify the issues that plagued him. He's a street rat? Steal the riches! Been abused? Become essentially invincible. Be considered nothing more than dirt by other people? Lord over them as the absolute ruler of the world. And ultimately, as he says,
Joy cannot be found by having an invincible body, vast riches, or even reigning over all humanity. In the end, the true winner is the one who gets to witness heaven.
As I've stated, you gotta remember this guy spent about 100 years with just himself and the corpse of Jonathan Joestar at the bottom of the sea, and he was an ever-living creature, left with only his thoughts and reflecting on the 20 years that he was actually alive before being confined to this very coffin at the bottom of the ocean. It's glossed over this fact, but I think it's an interesting thought process to consider Dio's position as a villain. And it makes more sense when you consider his plans to transform the world into Made in Heaven. Which, remember, Pucci's plan was Dio's plan, and the entire concept was to basically anticipate what the future would hold, that he would be the only man who constantly knows what was going to happen, what he was going to experience, and that he could be the only one to change it. It makes perfect sense considering that Dio's goals and ambitions were always snuffed out before they could really succeed, and who among us wouldn't want to change the past? And it was this plan that continued on within the man called Pucci. Dio's confidant, I think, would be a good word to use since Pucci was treated almost like an equal to him in their conversations, Dio even being pushed back a little by Pucci on things. And there was a lot of depth to Dio's character, and a lot of information that isn't explicitly stated in the series. Granted, a lot of people are more familiar with the memes associated with the character, as well as his appearance and fight within Part 3, which is probably one of the more iconic parts of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Dio's character is one of complexity when you look beyond the surface of his flashy appearance, and while he's totally written to be inexcusable, Araki has masterfully crafted a villain that has a lot more depth than what a lot of people would give credit towards. Dio is evil. Dio has reasons for being evil. But Dio doesn't apologize for his motives for the things that he does. Throw in the fact that Dio is probably one of the more visually appealing characters in JoJo, as well as how his visual presence works greatly with the series, it's no wonder why Dio's got a lot of love sent his way, even if he does some of the worst shit in the entire series. Hold up, do I really need to explain this one? I just got done telling you guys that there's a lot to Dio and why he's an amazing villain. His backstory is tragic, his abilities are dangerous, and he has more depth to him than the Ariana Trench. And even in death, he acts as the overarching villain for the entire first half of the series. It's clear that Dio was one of the most enticing antagonists ever made. He's a terrible threat to the protagonist, and he's teaming with not only stellar charisma, but he also represents the entirety of the franchise of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Everything that Dio does represents the over-the-top insanity that comes with the series. And he's a prominent figure of pop culture. Many people are aware of his iconic quotes before watching JoJo's Bizarre Adventure because of the memes that spawned from this character. Dio, while a character who has depth to him, is also just an evil bastard who revels in every single evil action that he performed. And his evil haunted the Joestars even after his actual death. An evil like Dio never truly dies. And frankly, He's probably what a lot of villains should be nowadays. If you made it this part of the video, I appreciate you watching, and I think we should cap this off with seeing how many of you made it by typing in the comments, "Kono Dio da!" I appreciate your time, thank you for watching this essay, and it's because of viewers like you that I can make these kinds of videos, and I hope to keep making them. Thank you so much for all your time, patience, and everything that you have done for me. I'm MangaKamen, thanks for watching, and don't forget to go...